He was born into the dust and wind of a young, divided nation, a boy named Wyatt Earp, on March 19, 1848, in Monmouth, Illinois. Long before the revolvers rang out across Tombstone, or his name became etched into the mythology of the American West, Wyatt Earp was simply one of 8 children in a restless frontier family. His father, Nicholas Porter Earp, a stern man with ambitions larger than his land could contain, instilled in his sons a rugged sense of purpose. Among Wyatt's brothers, it was Virgil and Morgan who would later ride closest beside him, forming the core of the Earp legend. But in 1848, they were simply boys born into a world where survival was earned by grit, luck, and a fast hand. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the Earp household became a staging ground of youthful ambition and patriotic fervor. Wyatt, only 13, watched his older brothers march away in Union blue. Fueled by a blend of admiration and a longing for glory, he tried repeatedly to enlist, running away from home more than once in the attempt. But each time his father found him, dragging him back from the edge of war. Yet even in failure, the pattern was set. Wyatt Earp would always chase the horizon, the next fight, the next cause, the next myth. His teenage years were an apprenticeship in motion. The Earp family drifted westward, pulled by the great American engine of expansion and the promise of gold land and opportunity. Wyatt worked in freight hauling, drove stagecoaches, and learned the rough arithmetic of violence in saloons where cards, fists, and revolvers determined fate. It was also during these years that he began gambling, a practice that would follow him like a shadow. Cards, money, and reputation, 3 things Wyatt would learn to handle with increasing precision. Boxing, too, made an early appearance, not with gloves in a ring, but in the dirt-floored alleys behind saloons where bets were made and reputations born. Refereeing these fights gave him a unique vantage point into the violent code of masculinity that defined the West. He would not be the strongest or the fastest man in the territory, but he understood something more valuable: control. When chaos erupted, Wyatt Earp learned to be the stillness at the center of the storm. In 1869, after years of drifting through the arteries of the expanding West, he returned to Missouri, where his father had become a constable in the town of Lamar. When Nicholas resigned, Wyatt stepped into the role. A young man suddenly handed the badge and the responsibility that came with it. Around this time, he married a local woman, Urilla Sutherland, a union full of youthful hope. But fate, cruel and uncompromising, dealt him a savage blow. Within a year she was dead, lost to typhoid or childbirth, perhaps both. The precise cause didn't matter. What mattered was that Wyatt Earp had felt love, and then loss, in the most brutal way imaginable. Her death marked a turning point. He abandoned his post. The lawman became the drifter once more. The grief-stricken man, hollowed by sorrow, descended into a shadow life of saloons, brothels, and border towns. He was arrested for horse theft in Arkansas, jailed, and then, true to form, he escaped. He ran to Peoria, Illinois, where he was seen in the company of a prostitute named Sally Heckle, who sometimes called herself his wife. Whether she was or wasn't, whether they loved or simply used each other to navigate the harsh currents of frontier life, is lost to time. What remains is this: Wyatt Earp, future symbol of frontier justice, was once branded a pimp, a fugitive, a man of dubious means. And yet, like so many legends of the West, he re-emerged from the haze of disgrace, wearing a badge again. In 1874, he became assistant marshal in Wichita, Kansas. It was in this role that a moment of humiliating humanity occurred. In the middle of a gambling house, his revolver fell from his holster and discharged when it struck the floor. The bullet passed through his coat and into the wall, causing panic and laughter in equal measure. The man who would become known for cold precision had, for one foolish moment, been just another greenhorn with a clumsy hand. It's said he begged his biographer to leave that story out, but the moment, stripped of shame, reveals something essential. Earp was never perfect. He was real. By 1876, Earp had moved on to Dodge City, a chaotic epicenter of cattle drives, saloons, and every flavor of sin the frontier could offer. It was there that he cemented his reputation as a lawman, dealing with cowboys too drunk to care who they crossed, and gamblers with hands quicker than snakes. He handled violence not with panicked aggression, but with methodical control. Bat Masterson, another gunslinger of growing fame, became his close ally. Dodge City wasn't just a waypoint, it was a crucible. Wyatt Earp didn't just survive it, he dominated it. He crossed paths with a man who would become inseparable from his legend. Doc Holliday, a tubercular gambler with a temper as volatile as nitroglycerin and a loyalty as rare as gold. Their meeting, during a pursuit of an outlaw named Dave Rudebois, began a friendship that would span years, gunfights, and the most mythologized 30 seconds in Western history. Doc Holliday, the death-haunted dentist from Georgia, would become the blade to Wyatt's shield. Together, they would stand against the rising tide of outlaws that plagued the Arizona Territory. But even before Tombstone, the blood had begun to spill. In Dodge City, Wyatt was involved in a skirmish with a drunken mob, one of whom was shot and later died. Historians debate whether Earp's bullet was the fatal one, but the story stuck. Another incident had Doc Holliday allegedly saving Earp's life during a standoff. Whether myth or truth, the tale added to the growing legend. Two men bound by fate and fire. And then came Tombstone, a silver boomtown rising out of the desolate Arizona soil. Tombstone was the last great frontier stage. When Wyatt arrived in December 1879 with Mattie Blaylock, his common-law wife, the town was raw, dangerous, and ripe for conflict. His brothers were already there, Virgil, the town marshal, Morgan riding shotgun for stagecoaches. Soon Doc Holliday joined them, and looming in the background was a shadowy syndicate known only as the Cowboys, a loosely organized band of outlaws, rustlers, and killers, among them the Clanton brothers, the McClorys, Curly Bill Brocious, and Johnny Ringo. The Cowboys didn't wear black hats and twirl their mustaches. They were farmers by day, killers by night. To the Earps, they represented chaos, lawlessness, and a direct challenge to their authority. The tension escalated until October 26, 1881, a date that would echo across generations. On that day, in a vacant lot near the OK Corral, the powder keg exploded. In less than 30 seconds, nearly 30 rounds were fired. When the smoke cleared, 3 cowboys were dead. Wyatt Earp stood untouched. It was not a duel. It was not honor-bound combat. It was a street fight, cold and deadly, where hesitation meant death. Newspapers twisted the facts, myths replaced testimonies, and Wyatt Earp, at once lawman and executioner, became immortal. But immortality comes at a price. There are moments in a man's life when fate offers a badge and a choice, order or chaos, justice or lawlessness. For Wyatt Earp, that moment came in 1869. He was just 21 when his father Nicholas stepped down as constable of Lamar, Missouri. The town, like many others on the American frontier, teetered between civility and savagery. The streets were dusty veins of uncertainty, and every saloon was both sanctuary and powder keg. Into this turbulent theater stepped Wyatt Earp, unshaven, wounded by the loss of his wife, but ready perhaps to become something more than just another drifting soul. He accepted the badge, and with it, the burden. For a time he served with diligence, walking the boardwalks of Lamar like a man trying to find absolution in the eyes of the law. That same year he married Urilla Sutherland, a young woman of grace and promise. She was 20, full of quiet strength, and in her, Wyatt found the kind of peace that eluded so many men of the West. For a fleeting moment, his future seemed to shimmer with possibility, a home, a wife, a life of order amidst the chaos. But the West is nothing if not cruel in its timing. Barely a year into their marriage, Urilla fell ill. Some say it was typhoid fever. Others whispered of complications from childbirth. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Her death shattered Wyatt like a whiskey bottle against saloon floorboards. In a single merciless moment, the lawman became a widower, and the man who had walked toward stability turned back toward the wild. The days that followed were lost in shadow. Wyatt left Lamar, abandoning his post and any claim to normalcy. He drifted through Kansas and Arkansas, picking up odd jobs and drinking with gamblers, drifters, and whores. In 1871, he was arrested for horse theft in Van Buren County. The charge, stealing 2 horses worth over $100, a serious crime in the post-war frontier where a horse was more than transport. It was survival. Wyatt spent some time behind bars, but soon escaped. How exactly remains unclear, whether by cunning, bribery, or chaos, but the jail cell door opened and Wyatt Earp vanished into the dust once more. He reappeared in Peoria, Illinois, alongside his brother Morgan. The Earp brothers were spotted often in the company of women known well to the local authorities, working girls who moved through the nights like ghosts in garters. One in particular, Sally Heckle, became a near-permanent fixture at Wyatt's side. She was a prostitute by trade, a survivor by necessity, and she sometimes told others she was Wyatt's wife. Whether she was or not mattered little. In the eyes of the Peoria press and law enforcement, Wyatt and Morgan weren't just companions to prostitutes, they were pimps. Police records from the time list both brothers as operating out of brothels disguised as boarding houses. In those unfiltered documents, Wyatt Earp's name appeared more than once, associated with establishments that blurred the lines between hospitality and vice. It was a fall from grace, and yet it was a chapter that would vanish almost entirely from the popular myth that would later emerge. The man who would be lionized as a frontier marshal was, for a time, a figure of seedy notoriety, no better than the very men he would one day gun down. And yet redemption, like ruin, is never far off in the story of Wyatt Earp. By 1874, the winds of fortune shifted. Earp moved west again and arrived in Wichita, Kansas, a cattle town on the rise, where cowboys flushed with trail money spilled into saloons like overflowing whiskey barrels. The town needed lawmen, and Wyatt, despite his past, had the instincts and steel for the job. He was hired as a police officer, an assistant marshal, tasked with keeping peace in a place that had little patience for hesitation. It was here that Earp began to reclaim something of the man he'd once intended to be. He wore the badge with a renewed sense of duty, dealing swiftly with brawlers and card cheats, gunmen and drunkards. But even amid this resurrection, fate kept him humble. One night in a Wichita gambling house, his pistol slipped from its holster and hit the floor. It discharged on impact, sending a bullet through his coat and into the wall, causing a stampede of panicked patrons. The incident became the talk of the town, and a deeply embarrassing moment for a man trying to build a reputation on poise under pressure. Years later, Wyatt would reportedly beg his biographer to omit the story. But in truth, it only served to humanize the man who would become a myth. He was not flawless. He was not a statue. He was flesh and blood, with moments of failure etched alongside his triumphs. Despite the mishap, Wyatt's conduct earned him respect in Wichita. But politics and rivalries in the town's administration ultimately pushed him out of the position. Unwilling to linger where he wasn't wanted, Earp followed the siren call of the next frontier hotspot, Dodge City. It was 1876 when he arrived. Dodge was a town drenched in dust, sweat, and sin. Cattle drives ended there, and men who had spent weeks on the plains exploded into town with their pockets full of cash and their brains empty of restraint. It was a place where the rule of law was a suggestion, not a guarantee. But for Wyatt Earp, it was also opportunity, a proving ground. He was soon appointed to the police force, working alongside one of the era's most storied lawmen, Bat Masterson. Together, they brought a brutal sort of order to Dodge City. Earp's approach was not flamboyant. He didn't wear flashy clothes or talk loud in saloons. He was calm, calculating, and above all efficient. When he drew his gun, it was to end a situation, not extend it. He didn't posture, he acted, and in the West, that made all the difference. In Dodge, Wyatt's legend began to crystallize. He became known for his resolve, his ability to de-escalate a fight with a few well-chosen words or a hard left hook. But make no mistake, he could shoot when it counted. Though gunplay was rare, when it came, he was cold and decisive. It was also in Dodge that Wyatt began to form the connections that would define the next decade of his life. Cowboys, gamblers, gunfighters, he crossed paths with them all. Some would become enemies, others, like Doc Holliday, would become brothers in arms. Rumors say that Holliday saved Wyatt's life in Dodge City during a late-night brawl when a drunk man reached for his gun. No official record confirms it, but Wyatt himself reportedly acknowledged it in later years. Whether myth or truth, The bond between Earp and Holiday would become one of the most iconic partnerships in American folklore. But Wyatt's time in Dodge was not without turmoil. He walked a razor's edge between lawman and outlaw, between justice and vengeance. The frontier didn't allow for clean lines. You did what you had to do. And for Wyatt Earp, the badge wasn't sacred. It was a tool. If the law failed, he would make his own justice. That philosophy would follow him into Arizona, into the blood-drenched streets of Tombstone, and into the history books as both savior and executioner. But before that, he remained a man in the making, reforged by each town he passed through. From the brothels of Peoria to the saloons of Wichita, from the rail yards of Arkansas to the cattle drives of Dodge City, Wyatt Earp collected scars, secrets, and stories. He wasn't yet the legend. He was still becoming. He was still haunted by the death of his wife, still shadowed by the sins of his past, still unsure if he was the lawman who restored order or the outlaw who merely wore the badge. But one thing was certain. He was rising. And with every mile west, with every outlaw tamed, with every confrontation walked away from, Wyatt Earp inched closer to the myth that would one day overshadow the man. A lawman, a fugitive, a gambler, a fighter, a man of contradictions riding toward destiny. The winds of the West whispered his name, and fate waited for him in a silver boom town called Tombstone. The real story was only just beginning. In the myth-soaked twilight of the American West, there are few names that echo like thunder across the plains. Wyatt Earp, of course, is one. But the name Doc Holliday? That name cuts like a cold wind across a sunburned desert. A gambler, a gunfighter, a dentist by trade, and a dying man by fate. But for Wyatt Earp, John Henry Doc Holliday would become more than a partner. He would become a brother in blood, bonded not by family but by fire. They met in the middle of chaos. The year was 1878. The air hung heavy over the lawless frontier towns of the Southwest, where justice was bought, sold, or buried beneath a dry riverbed. Wyatt was chasing a man named Dave Rudabaugh, an outlaw who had robbed a railroad camp and vanished into the dust. His pursuit took him to Fort Griffin, Texas, a hard town full of harder men. Gambling halls overflowed with sharp-eyed killers and smooth-talking thieves, and it was there, amid the smoke, cards, and clinking glasses, that Earp first met Doc Holliday. Holliday had a face pale as parchment and eyes like twin shards of blue ice. He coughed into a bloodied handkerchief, but held his cards like they were holy scripture. He was already notorious, a killer by necessity and a gambler by design. Tuberculosis gnawed at his lungs, a sentence he carried with defiant elegance. Death was his constant companion, which perhaps explained why he stared it down so easily in others. And yet, despite the violence that clung to him, there was an undeniable charm, a savage wit, and a loyalty that ran deeper than the grave. How exactly Wyatt and Doc struck their bond is lost to the vagaries of history. Some say it was respect, two men who saw steel in the other's soul. Others whisper it was convenience, alliance in the name of survival. But one tale persists, even if its truth remains in doubt. It's said that sometime after Dodge City, Wyatt found himself staring down a man with a pistol half drawn, death a twitch away. Before he could react, before breath could become trigger, a gun barked from the shadows, and the would-be killer fell to the floor. When Wyatt turned, he saw Doc lowering his smoking weapon. Holliday, the story goes, simply coughed and said, "I hate rudeness." Whether that moment happened or not is irrelevant. In the collective memory of the American frontier, it happened. In the stories whispered across saloon tables, in the dime novels and midnight retellings, it is carved in legend. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, two sides of a coin spinning on the edge of destiny. That story, like many others, would find its way into Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, the 1931 biography by Stuart Lake. It was the book that turned Wyatt into a national icon and Doc into his fearsome companion. But for all its influence, Lake's account blurred the line between history and hagiography. He turned Wyatt into a white-hatted crusader and Doc into a Shakespearean rogue. Truth was sacrificed for drama, and yet the myth became gospel. The version of Wyatt Earp that lives today, calm, righteous, deadly, was born not in Dodge City or Tombstone, but in the pages of that book. Still, even stripped of the Polish, the friendship between Wyatt and Doc was real. It was forged in gunfire, sealed in loyalty, and tested in the crucible of Tombstone. When Wyatt arrived in that town of silver dreams in December of 1879, he was not yet legend. He was tired. Worn thin by years of law work, gambling, and ghost chasing, he had come seeking something he'd never quite found: stability. He brought with him Mattie Blaylock, a former prostitute who now played the role of common-law wife. She was a woman of quiet tragedy, forever in the shadow of a man moving too fast to settle. Tombstone, they hoped, would be the place to finally rest. But Tombstone had other plans. Nestled in the southern Arizona territory, Tombstone was a town built atop veins of silver and sewn together with greed. It had risen from a handful of prospectors' tents to a boomtown of over 1,000 souls in less than a year. Its streets buzzed with the clamor of hammers, the creak of wagons, and the murmured prayers of men chasing wealth. For a while, Wyatt took work guarding stagecoaches for Wells Fargo, riding shotgun in the most literal sense, protecting freight from bandits who struck like ghosts from the hills. Soon his brothers followed. Virgil Earp, already a seasoned lawman, was appointed U.S. Deputy Marshal and took up duties as Tombstone's town marshal. Morgan Earp came next, eager to carve his place beside his brothers. James and Warren Earp were also in town, but it was Virgil, Morgan, and Wyatt who became the law's iron triangle, enforcing order in a town that desperately needed it, and resented it just as much. They were joined by Doc Holliday, who arrived like a storm cloud. Sick, sardonic, and deadly, Doc brought with him a reputation that walked faster than his stride. He took up gambling again, ran tables in the saloons, and joined the Earp brothers in their efforts to keep peace, a twisted kind of peace, on the blood-soaked streets of Tombstone. But peace is a fragile thing in a place like that. The Cowboys were already there, not a gang, not exactly, but a loose confederation of outlaws, rustlers, and killers. They wore red sashes and moved in packs. They were the night to the Earp's day, the chaos to their law. Among their number were names that would one day be carved into the darker side of history: Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory, Curly Bill Brocious, Johnny Ringo, Billy Claiborne. They drank deep, rode hard, and fired first, and they saw the arrival of the Earps, and especially Wyatt, as a challenge to their dominion. From the start, there was friction. The Cowboys bristled at being disarmed by the Earps, resented their badges, and mocked their attempts to impose order. What the Earps called justice, the Cowboys called tyranny. Minor confrontations escalated into threats into violence. It was an undeclared war, simmering beneath the surface of Tombstone's prosperity. Wyatt, despite his reputation, tried to play politics. He offered deals. He extended hands. He even considered running for sheriff of Cochise County, hoping that political legitimacy might give him the leverage he needed. But the Cowboys weren't interested in compromise. They believed in bullets, not ballots. They'd been the kings of Tombstone before the Earps arrived, and they didn't intend to surrender their throne. Every encounter tightened the noose. The streets became theaters of tension. Glances lingered too long, hands drifted too close to holsters. Doc Holliday, whose temper was shorter than his breath, frequently goaded the Cowboys, calling them cowards and worse. The saloons trembled with the weight of unspoken violence. And still, Wyatt Earp remained outwardly calm. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in the dust, taste it in the silence before the storm. He was not a man who sought blood, but when it came, he would be ready. Because Wyatt Earp understood something few others did. In the West, there were no clean lines between law and vengeance. There was only survival. There was only loyalty. And there was the unshakable knowledge that when the smoke cleared, only one side would be left standing. In the silver town of Tombstone, two worlds were colliding. The Old West, the wild, ungoverned, savage frontier, was meeting something newer. Hard men trying to build civilization, the Cowboys versus the Earps, chaos versus control, and walking between them like a ghost, like a deathless whisper with a deck of cards in one hand and a pistol in the other, was Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp's friend, his sword, and perhaps the only man in the West who knew what was coming and smiled anyway. The stage was set. The players were in place. And soon, in a vacant lot near a livery stable, the most famous gunfight in American history would burn its name into the desert. But for now, Tombstone held its breath, and Wyatt Earp, quiet and grim, waited for the hammer to fall. In the shifting light of Tombstone's early boom, shadows began to gather, not just from the tall buildings or the desert mesas beyond the town, but from the men who wore red sashes beneath their coats and carried with them the stench of violence masked as camaraderie. These were the Cowboys, and they were not just cattle drivers or ranch hands, as they might have claimed. They were a semi-organized brotherhood of outlaws, smugglers, and killers, men who moved through the Arizona territory with pistols on their hips and smirks on their faces, convinced the land was theirs to rule by bullet and fear. They weren't led by one single man, but operated like a swarm, unpredictable, chaotic, but devastating in motion. At their core were men like Curly Bill Brocius, whose laughter was said to echo louder than his pistol, and Johnny Ringo, a poetic killer whose eyes carried the weight of genius and death. Others, Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory, Pete Spence, Billy Claiborne, formed a volatile web of alliances. Some were rustlers, some were drunks, some were natural-born killers. All of them were trouble. The tension between the Earps and the Cowboys had begun as a spark, but by 1881 it had grown into a blaze ready to consume everything in its path. As lawmen, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, along with their ally Doc Holliday, tried to enforce the newly passed ordinance that prohibited the carrying of weapons inside city limits. The Cowboys saw this not as law, but as insult. They refused to disarm, believing they had carved out this town with their own sweat and gunpowder, and no badge was going to tell them otherwise. The confrontations were constant, stares across dusty streets, threats barked after too much whiskey. On more than one occasion, Virgil Earp arrested Cowboys for disorderly conduct, robbery, or suspicion of stagecoach holdups, but the legal system, riddled with corruption and sympathizers, consistently failed to convict them. Witnesses vanished. Evidence was conveniently lost. Judges were bought, juries intimidated. The law was a toothless dog, and the Cowboys knew it. And still, the Earps tried to hold the line. Each failure to bring justice only deepened the animosity. The Cowboys saw the Earps not just as obstacles but as enemies, and the Earps increasingly saw the Cowboys not just as criminals, but as a disease infecting the body of a town, struggling for legitimacy. The final escalation began in the weeks leading up to October 26, 1881. Threats from Ike Clanton grew bolder, his drunken tirades in saloons turning into promises of violence. "The Earps are walking dead men," he was heard to say. Days before the infamous shootout, tensions reached a boiling point when Virgil Earp arrested Ike for carrying weapons in town, pistol-whipping him and throwing him in jail overnight. Ike emerged angry and bruised, vowing vengeance. He wasn't alone. By the morning of October 26, the Clantons, McClorys, and others had gathered in Tombstone. Witnesses reported seeing them at Spangenberg's gun shop, loading up on ammunition. The townspeople murmured with unease. Everyone could feel the pressure building. Gunslingers were assembling. The Earps were arming. Something was coming. Virgil, still the town marshal, decided it was time to act. He would disarm the Cowboys in accordance with the law, but he knew he couldn't go alone. He brought with him his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, and one man they could always count on when steel met bone: Doc Holliday, sick as ever, but deadly as sin. At approximately 3 p.m., they walked toward Fremont Street, where the Cowboys had gathered near a vacant lot adjacent to the OK Corral. The newspapers would call it a shootout at the corral, but it happened closer to C.S. Fly's photography studio. History blurred the details, but the legend only grew. They approached 5 Cowboys: Ike and Billy Clanton, Tom and Frank McClory, and Billy Claiborne. Tensions were taut enough to snap. Virgil raised his hand and ordered them to disarm. According to multiple reports, the McClorys and Billy Clanton either refused or reached for their guns. And then, hell broke loose. The fight lasted 30 seconds. In that half-minute, 30 shots were fired. The noise was deafening, the smoke so thick you couldn't see 6 feet ahead. The air exploded with the sound of gunfire, men yelling, boots skidding in dust, hooves kicking in nearby stables. When the smoke cleared, Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, and Tom McClory lay in the dust, dead. Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne had run the moment the shooting began. Morgan Earp had been hit in the shoulder. Virgil was wounded in the leg. Doc Holliday had a grazing hip wound. Wyatt Earp stood untouched. The town fell silent. The streets, once filled with curious onlookers, now held only whispers and blood. The Earps had survived, but the cost was only beginning to tally. The aftermath was immediate and explosive. Ike Clanton, nursing both his rage and his pride, filed charges of murder against the Earps and Doc Holliday. The town that had hailed Wyatt as a hero now turned its eyes on him with suspicion. The brothers were arrested, Wyatt and Doc first, with Morgan and Virgil following after they recovered enough to appear in court. The trial began in a climate of tension and looming violence. The presiding judge was Wells Spicer, and he had no easy task. Witnesses were plentiful, but their stories contradicted one another at every turn. Cowboys claimed the Earps had fired first, with no warning. Supporters of the Earps said the Cowboys had drawn first, their hands trembling on the handles of their revolvers. Even neutral bystanders offered inconsistent accounts, shaped by fear, politics, or convenience. The trial lasted nearly a month. Day after day, Spicer listened to stories of badges and bullets, of threats made and insults exchanged. He read depositions and cross-examined surviving participants. The weight of the case threatened to crack the town in half, but in the end, the evidence leaned toward the Earps. The Cowboys had been armed, in violation of city law. The Earps had tried to disarm them as marshals. The gunfight, while brutal, had occurred in the line of duty. And though the truth of who shot first would remain murky forever, the intentions of the Cowboys, gathering with guns, issuing threats, provoking lawmen, painted them in a darker hue. Judge Spicer issued his verdict. No charges would be filed. The Earp brothers and Doc Holliday were cleared of wrongdoing. But justice did not bring peace. In fact, it unleashed something worse. The Cowboys, humiliated and enraged, would not forget. Virgil and Morgan, already wounded, knew they were marked. And Wyatt, though victorious in court, was no longer protected by the badge or the law. The fragile veneer of order had cracked, and the true war for Tombstone was just beginning. The gunfight at the OK Corral became instant legend. Newspapers twisted it into myth. East Coast readers, far from the grit of Arizona's streets, devoured stories of brave lawmen and evil outlaws. Wyatt Earp became a household name, a symbol of frontier justice. But the reality was far grayer. The gunfight wasn't a duel between good and evil. It was a collision of men shaped by violence, pride, and the belief that they alone held the right to enforce order. It was a tragedy written in powder burns and blood, and though 3 cowboys had died, the fight for Tombstone's soul had only just begun. Virgil, crippled, Morgan, wounded, Doc, coughing up blood with every breath, and Wyatt, walking forward, his blue eyes colder than ever. Behind him, justice had failed. Before him, vengeance waited. And the West, as always, watched in silence. The blood that soaked the dirt of Tombstone on October 26, 1881, had barely begun to dry when the darkness deepened. The gunfight at the OK Corral had not ended the war. It had merely lit a fuse. What followed was not justice. It was retribution. It was rage. It was the slow unraveling of any hope that law and order could stand untouched in the winds of the American frontier. The Cowboys had been wounded, but they were not dead, and they had long memories. On the night of December 28, 1881, the streets of Tombstone were cold and silent, the town trembling under the weight of what was to come. Virgil Earp, still recovering from the wounds he sustained at the OK Corral, had just finished dinner at the Oriental Saloon. He stepped out into the chill air, walking back toward his room at the Cosmopolitan Hotel where his family waited. He was no longer a man in his prime, but still he walked tall, with the same badge pinned to his chest, daring the world to challenge him. But that night, the world answered. As Virgil crossed 5th Street, gunmen emerged from the shadows, shotguns raised, barrels glowing faintly under the gas lamps. They fired in unison. 3 or 4 blasts ripped through the quiet, the echoes crashing through the stillness like thunder in a canyon. Virgil was thrown to the ground, his body riddled with buckshot, his left arm shattered, a bullet carving a path across his back and another ripping into his leg. By sheer force of will, he crawled inside the hotel, blood trailing behind him like ink from a broken pen. Against every odd, he survived. But the price was steep. His left arm was destroyed, never to be used again. The Cowboys had made their answer clear. They would not fight in courtrooms or open streets. They would strike from the shadows and kill without warning. Wyatt Earp had seen violence before, but this was different. Then came the final straw. On the night of March 18th, 1882, Wyatt was playing billiards with his brother Morgan in a saloon on Allen Street. The laughter was real, though strained, an attempt to push past the fear that hung over them like a storm cloud. They were watched men, hunted men, but still, they played, still tried to act like life could go on, and then the shots came. A bullet crashed through the window behind them, the first of several. One slug struck Morgan in the back, tearing through his spine and shattering his kidneys. Another bullet missed Wyatt by inches, lodging in the wall near his head. Morgan collapsed. Blood spread across the floor, staining the green felt of the billiards table. Wyatt cradled his brother in his arms, helpless, as the life drained out of him. Morgan looked at him, eyes fading, and whispered his final words, "I can't see a damn thing." He died minutes later, and something inside Wyatt Earp died with him. The next morning, Wyatt was done with the law as it stood. Done with courts, judges, and bureaucrats who offered no protection. Tombstone had shown its hand. There was no justice here, only the illusion of it, broken and bleeding on the floor of a saloon. The badge he now wore meant only one thing: revenge. He was appointed a deputy U.S. Marshal, giving him legal cover, but this was not about law anymore. It was about vengeance, and it would come quickly. Wyatt formed a posse, a hand-picked group of men who were not just friends but warriors. Doc Holliday, ever loyal, Warren Earp, their younger brother, now burning with the same fire, Sherman McMasters, Texas Jack Vermillion, Turkey Creek Johnson, Dan Tipton, Charlie Smith, each a man hardened by war, betrayal, or the bitter taste of death. Together, they would ride into history, and they would leave bodies behind. Their first target was a man named Frank Stillwell, a known cowboy and a suspected accomplice in Morgan's murder. Stillwell was last seen trailing the Earp family as they escorted Morgan's coffin to the train station in Tucson, where it would be shipped to California. Wyatt, Virgil, now maimed, and other family members were aboard the train, watching silently. Stillwell was there. Wyatt saw him lurking near the rail yard, possibly preparing to finish what had begun with Morgan. Wyatt and his posse confronted him. Stillwell ran. He didn't get far. Later, his body was found riddled with bullets, his face unrecognizable, his chest torn open by shotgun blasts. It was a brutal execution, and though Wyatt never denied it, no formal charges ever stuck. Some say he discharged both barrels of his shotgun into Stillwell at close range. Others say he beat the man before killing him. It didn't matter. Stillwell was dead. The vendetta had begun. Now the manhunt widened. Over the following weeks, Wyatt's posse rode through the deserts and mountains, seeking out the men responsible, not just for Morgan's murder, but for the failure of justice in Tombstone. They were judge, jury, and executioners, traveling fast, hitting hard, and leaving no room for mercy. They tracked a cowboy named Florentino Cruz, who allegedly had acted as a lookout the night Morgan was killed. He was caught and killed, shot so many times that his corpse became unrecognizable. Others, like Pete Spence, got wind of the posse and surrendered to authorities, choosing prison over death. The Earp vendetta ride had become infamous. Outlaws now feared the lawmen, a reversal of the frontier order. But the final confrontation, the moment that cemented Wyatt Earp's transformation into legend, came at a place called Iron Springs. The posse received word that Curly Bill Brocius, the ruthless cowboy and suspected orchestrator of Morgan's murder, was camped near the Whetstone Mountains with a group of followers. Wyatt led his men through the arid landscape, tracking the killers like wolves in the brush. When they found the camp, they didn't wait. The attack was swift and thunderous. Wyatt, at the front of the charge, rode straight into gunfire. Bullets cracked through the air, carving past his head and horse. His coat was pierced by buckshot, his saddle ripped apart, and still he rode on. He spotted Curly Bill near a mesquite bush, raising a shotgun. Wyatt raised his own double barrel and fired both barrels into the man's chest, hitting him square. Curly Bill flew backward, dead before he hit the ground. The remaining cowboys broke, scattering in all directions. Johnny Barnes, another outlaw, was shot and later died from his wounds. Wyatt's posse had been outnumbered, but not a single man was injured. They had faced death, and won. With Curly Bill gone, the cowboys began to collapse. Some disappeared into Mexico. Others turned themselves in. Johnny Ringo, perhaps the most enigmatic of the gang, was later found dead with a bullet in his head. Officially ruled a suicide, though rumors persist that Wyatt or Doc pulled the trigger. Billy Claiborne was shot and killed later that year in Tombstone by buckskin Frank Leslie during a drunken dispute. Ike Clanton fled, but was shot and killed in 1887 while resisting arrest for cattle rustling. The vendetta had done its work. There would be no trials, no grand jury indictments, no closure. Only silence. The blood had been spilled, and the desert drank it deeply. Legal consequences? Almost none. The Arizona Territory attempted to issue warrants for Wyatt and his men, but by then they were already ghosts, moving from state to state, never lingering long enough for the law to catch up. The federal government, satisfied that the violence had ceased, turned its gaze elsewhere. Tombstone, once a city of silver and promise, now felt haunted. The Earp family left. Wyatt would never return. And so ended the vendetta ride. A campaign not of law, but of personal justice, born in grief and carried out with unrelenting fury. It was the last great act of frontier vengeance, a ride drenched in myth, blood, and the kind of justice that only survives in the dust of legends. For Wyatt Earp the man, there would be more years, more ventures, and more stories. But the man who rode into Iron Springs leveled a shotgun at Curly Bill and walked out untouched. That Wyatt Earp died in the desert. What remained was the myth. Unforgiving, unbending, unbroken. After the dust settled in Tombstone, after the smoke of vengeance had drifted across the canyons, and the blood dried in the streets, Wyatt Earp became something even more elusive than a gunslinger. He became a man in search of peace. With the violence of Arizona behind him and the weight of grief still burning in his chest, Wyatt packed his few belongings and, alongside Josephine Marcus, the woman who would remain his companion for the rest of his life, headed west once more. This time to San Francisco, a city bustling with electricity, steamships, and the promise of reinvention. There, amid the clang of trolley cars and the fog rolling off the bay, Wyatt Earp tried to live a life that no longer needed a holster. He invested in mining ventures. He dabbled in horse racing. He owned and lost several saloons. The years that followed were quieter than the ones that made him famous, but still the West had not forgotten him. In 1883, a brief moment of the old life flared up again. When friend and fellow gunman Luke Short found himself embroiled in a conflict in Dodge City, one of the last great outposts of the Wild West, he called on Wyatt for help. What followed wasn't a shootout, but a show of power. A gathering of former lawmen, gamblers, and gunslingers, including Bat Masterson and Charlie Bassett, united to protect Short's interests. They posed for a photo, a group known as the Dodge City Peace Commission. It was a picture that froze a moment in time, a gallery of legends, faces etched with grit and steel, men who had survived the frontier and stood now as its icons. In that black and white image, Wyatt stares into the lens with the quiet ferocity of someone who has seen too much and lost even more. That photo would go on to become one of the most famous portraits of the Old West, a reminder that myth sometimes walks beside truth in broad daylight. But even in the city, Wyatt Earp could not outrun controversy. In 1896, he found himself in the center of a scandal that was not decided by bullets, but by fists. The boxing world was in a frenzy. Tom Sharkey was set to fight Bob Fitzsimmons, and with no clear governing body in place to appoint a referee, the promoters turned to someone with a reputation for unquestionable integrity, Wyatt Earp. It was a fateful decision. The fight took place at the Mechanics Pavilion in San Francisco, with thousands in attendance. The crowd roared, fists flew, and Fitzsimmons dominated the ring. In the 8th round, he landed what appeared to be a clean knockout punch to Sharkey's midsection. The audience erupted in cheers, but then came Earp's ruling. He stepped forward and declared the blow illegal, calling it a low hit, and awarded the fight to Sharkey. Gasps turned to outrage. The crowd, stunned, began to murmur. Reporters scribbled furiously. Fitzsimmons' corner was livid. No one else in the building had seen a foul. No one but Wyatt. The fallout was immediate. The decision was challenged in court. Allegations of fight-fixing, bribery and collusion filled the newspapers. Although Wyatt was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing, the damage had been done. The man who had once been the symbol of frontier justice was now painted as a corrupt figure, willing to sell fairness for a payday. It was a new kind of wound, one not caused by bullets, but by public scorn. In the following years, Wyatt drifted. He returned to mining, tried his luck in Nome, Alaska during the gold rush, and later moved to Los Angeles, where the West had gone to die quietly behind studio walls. There, in the cradle of early Hollywood, Wyatt Earp became an unlikely relic, a living legend among silent film stars. Directors, actors, and producers would visit his modest bungalow just to shake the hand of a man who had stood at the OK Corral, who had ridden in vengeance across the desert, who had turned the law into a weapon. One of those actors was a young John Wayne, who would later claim he modeled his on-screen demeanor after Earp's quiet authority. But time, relentless as ever, began to catch up. Josephine stayed by his side, fiercely protective of the man she saw not as a gunslinger, but as a survivor. Wyatt grew old, his health deteriorating slowly. He never again picked up a gun in anger. He never returned to Tombstone. On January 13, 1929, Wyatt Earp died in Los Angeles of chronic cystitis, likely a complication of liver disease, at the age of 80. It was a quiet death for a man whose life had roared like thunder across a continent. He had outlived nearly every legend of his era. He had survived shootouts, ambushes, scandals, and betrayal. In a time when most men died young, Wyatt Earp endured. His body was cremated. His ashes were buried in Colma, California, in the Jewish Hills of Eternity Cemetery, next to Josephine, who would join him in death years later. A simple gravestone marks the spot, etched with the names of a man and a woman who crossed deserts, dodged bullets, and left their footprints in the marrow of American history. 2 years later, in 1931, a journalist named Stuart N. Lake published a book titled Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. It was the first major biography of the man, and it changed everything. Lake painted Wyatt not just as a lawman, but as a paragon of virtue, a fearless knight in a dusty land, a symbol of righteous force in a lawless age. The book was wildly successful. Hollywood took notice. Radio dramas, comic books, and eventually Western films turned Wyatt Earp into a household name. His legend grew larger than his truth, eclipsing the darker chapters of his life. The horse theft, the brothels, the vendetta killings, and the boxing scandal. Stuart Lake didn't lie exactly, but he polished the edges, sanding down the grit and leaving only the gleam. What remained was a myth wrapped in a badge carried through generations. From Henry Fonda to Kurt Russell, from dusty saloons to silver screens, Wyatt Earp became the West. Not just a man, but a story we told ourselves about justice, about courage, about what it means to draw a line in the sand and say, no more. He was a flawed man, without doubt, sometimes cruel, sometimes vengeful. But he also represented the raw, brutal heart of an America still forming itself, torn between law and lawlessness, between civility and survival. He wasn't a saint. He was something more honest than that. He was Wyatt Earp. And whether he stood with his brothers at the OK Corral, or rode through the night on his vendetta ride, or simply sat alone in a hotel room wondering if history would remember him kindly, he remains the last great echo of the frontier, a man who became a legend who became a myth who became immortal.